Good afternoon again. I hope you all enjoyed your lunch. We're delighted that Sir Richard Shirreff, a retired general of the British Army and former Deputy Supreme Allied Commander of Europe of NATO, is here with us today to discuss the role that Russia plays in the world. His book will be available for purchase and signing from the bookseller right over there after the event. Today's event is being live streamed, which means it's on the record, which also means we'd like you to silence your phones so that that isn't captured for all the world to see. We're in the middle of our fall programming season. We have several upcoming programs which you might be interested in. Actually, on Monday, we're hosting an exciting half-day symposium on the global rise of populism, featuring participants such as Ivo Daalder, the president of the council, and Robin Niblett from Chatham House. Registration will be open till about Saturday on that. We have a few seats left. 1 week from today, on Thursday, October 26th, Ivo Daalder will lead an expert discussion on U.S. perspectives on foreign policy, the Chicago release of our recent public opinion survey. Before we begin, a brief disclaimer. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs is an independent, nonpartisan organization that convenes leading global voices, engages the public, and conducts independent research to provide insights and influence public discourse on critical global issues. The views of individuals expressed on this platform, including our website, are their own, and they do not represent the institutional positions or views of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, its members, or its supporters. Turning back to today, our speaker will give a few brief remarks, and we'll open up the floor for audience Q&A. For now, please welcome our introducer today, Board Director at USO Illinois and Director Circle Member of the Council, George Gilmour.
Good afternoon. When Don first called me and asked me to provide the introduction, I was saying, why me? And so we thought about it. Besides, I draw the short lot or long lot or whatever. And kind of parallels, the closest I can get to Sir Richard is I lived in Europe all my life. And as Don knows, I'm an Army brat, and my father was career counterintelligence. So as I looked at what Sir Richard has written, it's a very timely book. I remember as a little boy, growing up in Germany, in Munich, when Germany was occupied because of a lot of the things that happened that got us to World War II. Then I remember the '56 Hungarian uprising. Again, my father was off in Vienna, and I was in Munich. Moved up to Berlin. The night the wall went up, my family was on the military train going to Frankfurt. So it's real time. But again, my father was a Stasi and KGB specialist in counterintelligence. So I got to understand some of the things that Russians might do or might not do. And then I ended up in the military, not as long as you, sir, but my 5 years in Europe, I was transportation. I ran the ports in Europe. I worked in Antwerp with the British military there. I was having such a good time. I moved over to London and then spent 2.5 years in London working with the British military there. But today, again, really important and timely book. You see it in the discussions of the elections. You see what's happened in Russia. You see Ukraine. You saw Georgia, the cyber in Georgia. Vladimir Putin, things he's saying, he's doing, concerns. Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, very high on their list. So it's a really important topic, and one of the things that I was looking at about the book, we're commemorating the 100 years of World War I. And one of the big books that came out just recently about World War I was the sleepwalking into World War I. It's did we kind of back into this thing, and all of a sudden we got this disaster. So that's some of the themes that I think we're going to hear about. And then culminating with Sir Richard, Deputy NATO Commanding General. Can't get any higher than that. So he has the big perspective of what's happening, not only from the military, the economic, the political. So he's bringing that all together. 37 years with the military. He was commissioned in 1976. For the Americans in the audience, I'll calibrate that. John Abizaid graduated in '73 from West Point. Marty Dempsey graduated in '74 from West Point. Odierno and McChrystal graduated in '76, so you're your colleagues. So those are the people that Sir Richard's been dealing with. Tremendous experience. Again, I have to think about this, always look at it from what would my daughter be asking? And I was kind of looking at it and doing my research, and Sir Richard graduated from Exeter. Why is that important? Well, I'm an old track guy. Roger Bannister, first 4-minute mile, Exeter. Again, when I went to college, J.R.R. Tolkien was the book to read as you're going in. I understand, was it J.K. Rowling's got an honorary degree or something like that from there? So that would please my daughter. And then for the people, Richard Burton is also a graduate. So, I mean, tremendous background, keen insights. I think this is going to be a very exciting discussion. And so, Richard, please.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. Exeter College, Oxford, a fairly eclectic group of people. You might also add Tariq Ali, who was a very firm student activist in the 1960s. Ladies and gentlemen, it is a huge pleasure, a great honor, and a privilege to be here with you in Chicago. It's a chance to build on old friendships made in Brussels days. Elissa, lovely to see you, and please pass my thanks and warmest regards to Ivo. It's my first visit to Chicago, and my goodness me, for those of you who know it, you probably have no idea of the impression it makes on a brand newcomer. There is a real sense, and I'm pretty familiar with the East Coast, not least, and when you go to Massachusetts and Boston and around Washington, an awful lot of English names in Virginia and in Massachusetts. But you come to Chicago, and there's no doubt you are right in America proper, and it really hits you. It's fantastic. I couldn't help but notice the shy, retiring little building opposite my hotel when I arrived last night, which I had to send immediately a picture on WhatsApp back home just to make the point, of course, big TRUMP on it. More of that later, perhaps. And actually, that does give me my first sort of segue into where I want to begin, which is to reinforce the reality of the fact that since the formation of NATO in 1949, the defense of Europe, and I would argue as well the defense of America, has depended on the knowledge, the absolute certainty and the knowledge that whatever American president is occupying the White House, America will always come to the aid of a NATO member if attacked. So any suggestion otherwise, and we've had a couple, I'm afraid, make the scenario that I outline in this book more, not less likely. Let's just look a little bit at Mr. Putin, Vladimir Vladimirovich's words and deeds. And I think, for me, my epiphany came in 2014, March 2014, when the Crimea was invaded, which was a very slick, professional, and effective military operation by any standards. If we look at the speech that he made, and I well remember the morning after this particular speech on the 18th of March 2014, were the day that Crimea was admitted into the Russian Federation. General Skip Davis, a very, very impressive, lean, youthful airborne officer who does figure, his alter ego figures slightly in the book, came into the comprehensive crisis management operations center, where we were being briefed, and I was with, obviously, General Phil Breedlove-Sacker. And Skip gave us a copy of this speech, or he outlined some of the key points in this speech. And I said, I think this is a paradigm-shifting speech. I think we will be looking at this speech and recognizing this as the moment things really did change. Let's just look at some of the things that Mr. Putin said in that. And here, of course, is the man who described the breakup of the Soviet Union as the greatest geostrategic catastrophe of the 20th century. So, for him, 2 world wars and the Holocaust come second, third, or fourth to that. He's really serious about this. He majored on the threat the West poses to Russia. Time and again, he said, we were deceived. Time and again, the decisions were made behind our backs. And the same happened when they made their expansion to the east and deployed military structures on our borders. He set this grievance in a historical context so that it resonated more. We have all the reasons to believe that the policy of containment of Russia that was happening in the 18th, the 19th, the 20th centuries is still going on. We might just come back to that. And he warns the West to expect Russia to push back. If you press the spring, it will release, something you should remember. As for Ukraine, we are not just neighbors, we are one country. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. And what he described as the latest events in Ukraine, the events of the Maidan and the shift of government there, obviously, was the product of terror, of murders, pogroms conducted by anti-Semites, Russophobes, nationalists, and neo-Nazis. And his vision for the future, uniting Russian speakers under Russia, is the desire of the people. The absolute majority of the people is clear. 95% of the Russian population think that Russia should protect the interests of Russians, even if it will worsen our relations with some states. But he's predictably reassuring about Russia's good intentions for the future of Ukraine, what he calls other regions, by which I think we can infer he means other countries, other states with significant Russian-speaking minorities. Don't trust those who frighten you with Russia, he said. And I'm told by those who've heard him, he speaks in a very mellifluous, persuasive voice. So don't trust those who frighten you. We're not in the business of frightening you. Those who say that Crimea will be followed by other regions. We do not want to split Ukraine. Well, here we are 2.5 years later. Ukraine is split. The war continues. This is war in Europe, and it continues on a daily basis, despite the second Minsk ceasefire. Thousands are dead in the war in its eastern regions. Effectively, therefore, by his actions, Putin has ripped up the post-Cold War settlement of Europe. And that was a settlement based as much as anything on working with Russia as a strategic partner. So any thoughts, I'm afraid, of Russia as a strategic partner are now gone. And in the words of a man that many of you will know and respect, as I do, Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, who's just stepped down as the Deputy Secretary General to NATO, Russia is now de facto a strategic adversary. And that threat continues to ratchet. Now, I wrote the book in 2015, between about, well, May and December was the real sort of burst of the major mother of all essay crises, as I call it. And actually, I would say that since then, that ratchet of the threat just goes on clicking up relentlessly. We saw the deployment of significant, the level of Russian military activity, the deployment of formation of 3 motor rifle divisions announced in January on the borders of the Baltic states in Western Military District. Now, our division is around about 15 to 20,000 personnel. So that is a significant force. And as an aside, I don't think even America would find it difficult to get a division out of the door in quick time. And no other NATO nation can do that in less than a year. Fact, I would say. The level of military activity, the constant overflights, the infringement of airspace, and not just over the Baltic states, but the testing, the probing, I mean, even with great excitement when Russian bears started flying west up the English Channel. The snap exercises that continue, the call out of up to 30 to 40,000 troops on a snap exercise, and one recent snap exercise practicing the invasion and occupation of the Baltic states as a scenario. Well, what's that about in the 21st century? Let's go back, though, to thinking a little bit from the Russian perspective. And that point I made earlier, the point that Putin talked about, the policy of containment. Does he have a point? I think it is a fact that deep in Russian DNA is a fear of encirclement. Deep in Russian DNA is the notion that the only way to protect Russia from the West is through space. So they would look back to the Polish, the Swedish, the French, and of course the Nazi invasion of 1941 and Barbarossa. And indeed, a measure of that was a Russian general, senior Russian general, I can remember, who came to SHAPE when I was there, and he pointed to a map, and he pointed to a German logistic base servicing the German effort in northern Afghanistan. This German logistic base was in Uzbekistan, and he said, there you are. He said, that's proof. That's what we mean. That's NATO encirclement. It just shows you the sort of level of thinking and the nature of the thinking that is embedded in the DNA. But meanwhile, Russia continues to threaten its neighbors and to dominate the near abroad with these regular snipe exercises. Now, the expansion of NATO, it was not clever, I would suggest, of NATO to promise NATO membership to Ukraine and Georgia in 2008. From a military perspective, that is a promise that is almost impossible to support in terms of support to Ukraine under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. And equally, from a psychological perspective, it's difficult to think of anything that could get more under the nose, as it were, of whoever is in the Kremlin, given the place of Kiev and in Russian history, Kievska Rus, and the origin of the Orthodox faith and all that. But nevertheless, NATO, even after Georgia 2008, which held up a mirror to NATO, if NATO had been prepared to really look in the mirror, even after Georgia, NATO has been assiduous in returning to what you might call business as usual with Russia, the recognition of the importance of that strategic partnership. Perhaps too assiduous, because I think that sent a signal to the Kremlin that aggression in the near abroad was okay, that a blind eye would be turned. But what do we think is the intent here? What do we think is in Putin's mind? The answer is, of course, I don't know, but I think it's a fair deduction to make that while he does not, I don't think, want to see the re-establishment of the Soviet Union, I do think he wants to see Russia re-established as a great power. I think he wants to protect Russian interests by re-establishing Russian power in the former republics of the Soviet Union, the near abroad. And I think that notion of protection of Russian speakers remains pretty high. Now, there's an extraordinary, almost 19th century imperialist view here that the way you protect yourself is by stomping over the interests of your near neighbors. And I think there's another almost 19th century imperialist view, which perhaps I find rather attractive as a Brit, that we should somehow extend our power over all English-speaking people in the world. I think it's a great idea, but I'm not sure it's politically realistic. But that sort of linguistic imperialism and that other imperialism just sits rather uneasily, frankly, in a globalized world. So the reality is that Mr. Putin has started a dynamic, I think, which has put potentially Russia on a collision course with NATO, over the Baltic states in particular. NATO members, all of them, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia in particular, Lithuania lesser so, with significant Russian-speaking minorities. And of course, this is really dangerous because under Article 5 of the Washington Treaty, as you will all know, an attack on one is an attack on all. And if by any stretch of the imagination or reality that happened, it means war with NATO. And of course, I suggest it means nuclear war because the Russians integrate nuclear thinking into every aspect of their defense doctrine. And that means that's serious stuff. Now, you may well say, hang on, let's be rational here. To go from the invasion of Crimea to a nuclear war over the Baltic states is one big ask in terms of logic. And you would be absolutely right. All I would say to that is that looking at strategy, we should never forget the human dimension of strategy, and human beings are not always rational. So our job is to ensure that the risks are so high that there could be no seizing of any opportunity. And hence, I think your point here, the dangers of inaction are critical here, and we must address that and put that right. And then if you look as well at the internal dynamics of Russia, and we were discussing this briefly earlier, the economy tanking, the challenge they face as a result of what look to be long-term low oil prices, the huge increase in military spending, the need to continue to feed the Russian population with red meat in order to maintain personal popularity ratings. And I think that also highlights the concerns. Listen to what Dmitry Kiselev, the Kremlin's chief propagandist, and the man who boasted on TV that only Russia has the capability to reduce America to radioactive dust. And he said even a decision about the use of nuclear weapons will be taken personally by Mr. Putin, who has the undoubted support of the Russian people. Posturing at home, yes, but nevertheless a chilling message abroad. Is this a return to the Cold War? It might be a return to the early Cold War years, the early Cold War years before the rules of the game were set. But if you look at the later Cold War years, by the time, there were rules of the game, there were channels of communication, and despite the massive lineup of military force on either side of the Iron Curtain, there was actually a degree of stability, particularly in the Central Front in Europe. And I would also suggest that even at times like the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Politburo, who perhaps, and Russia, those who know Russia much better than me will be able to comment, but perhaps occupied, there was a greater degree of collective decision-making than there is now, I suggest. The Politburo's memories were colored by recent experience of the dreadful casualties that they had incurred during the Great Patriotic War. So I think in some ways this is more like the 1930s, particularly as I look at Europe. Weak, politically weak, not economically, but politically weak, militarily disarmed, in some cases near pacifist Western democracies, facing an autocrat who has increased defense spending significantly, has got very capable armed forces, has really thought through the balance between asymmetric, hybrid, conventional warfare, and we might discuss and explore that a little bit later, with an autocrat in the driving seat who is the ultimate opportunist, a man who is facing economic challenges at home, who may well decide that the way to give his population red meat is through that traditional remedy of autocrats looking for adventures abroad, but who's also demonstrated his willingness to change the boundaries of force and to support war in Europe, and appears to be getting away with it. Coming closer to home, why does this matter to America? Well, number one, I would suggest, and I stand corrected, but rather in the same way that the defense of the United Kingdom does not start on the White Cliffs of Dover, it starts in the forests of Lithuania and Estonia and Latvia, I would suggest that even Fortress America needs to think about the fact that your security is dependent on European security, in the sense that here we are 99 years after America sent its first large commitment to a European war, and 100,000 young Americans did not come back. And it was America, I go back to where I started, that absolutely underpinned European security, but also for American interests. So this could mean war. And arguably, of course, Russia is at war with America already. If we look at Russian hybrid war, what do we mean by that? Well, look at Crimea. Look at what happened in Estonia with the first cyber attacks. This is the undermining of the integrity of the target state from within, below the threshold which might be deemed to be conventional war, below the threshold at which an Article 5 declaration might be declared, through manipulation of minorities by clever, sophisticated, very entertaining Kremlin TV, through the use of special forces, and of course, through the use of cyber. So I'm in no doubt that what we've been seeing recently with attacks, with the manipulation, the leaks of emails and the like, that is all Russian hybrid war designed to undermine the integrity of the American political system. So it really matters. Because what better? Absolutely is going to suit Mr. Putin if he has in the Kremlin, forgive that Freudian slip, if he has in the White House a man who has expressed a degree of uncertainty about whether America would come to the aid of a NATO member if attacked. And don't forget the words of Dmitry Trenin, who heads up the Moscow Carnegie Center, a very respected think tank, and a man who's got very close contacts to the regime, who has said that the Kremlin effectively has been at war since 2014. Well, just coming back to the book, and this is I'm afraid to say it's a pretty trashy novel set in the future. Why is it a novel? Because I thought that it would be a way of reaching out to I've contributed to 3 think tank papers, 2 Atlantic Council papers, and recently with the ICDS based in Tallinn did some work alongside on Baltic security. But I'm very conscious that who reads think tank papers? Other think tankers. Actually, we need to understand. We need to get this through to our taxpayers and those in the general population who may have no particular interest in defence and who may think that everything's okay and that we're properly protected. So it's about the Baltic states, and I declare huge admiration and respect for those 3 small nations who effectively on their own achieved freedom from the Soviet Union. It was by no means a given that they were going to be able to break away, and they did it on their own. And I think we should give them respect for that. And they have been very loyal NATO allies who have paid a significant, particularly recently, cost in blood and treasure in Afghanistan with the NATO alliance. And it is absolutely right that those freedom-loving, Western-orientated, liberal states are part of the NATO alliance, because that is what NATO is all about. It's definitely about the threat posed by Russia. It's about the imperative of effective deterrence, and understanding that deterrence has got to be credible. And in order to be credible, it's got to be militarily effective. But I would also say it's not just about military. It's the wider piece. And I focus on the military, but of course deterrence covers economic, it covers financial, it covers diplomatic, it covers a wider suite as well. I would also highlight here the importance of, as well as deterrence, of dialogue, because that is missing at the moment. Yes, I know, we all know that that Secretary Kerry's heroic efforts in Geneva and trying to broker a deal over Syria, but there aren't the channels of communication with Russia that we need. So deterrence backed by dialogue, but not unconditional dialogue. A dialogue based, number 1, on respecting NATO and NATO sovereignty and the sovereignty of NATO nations, a respect for international law, and a respect for the sovereignty and the right to live uninterfered with by Russia's immediate neighbours. So it's about deterrence. It's about, from a specific on a UK perspective, a criticism of the reluctance to step up to responsibility, but above all, and I think this is the key message for here, it is about the imperative of strong American leadership in NATO. As the first NATO Secretary General, Lord Ismay, said, NATO is about keeping the Russians out, the Germans down, and the Americans in. Well, objective number 1, yes. Objective number 2, I think we could turn that round completely and get the Germans up, but it's absolutely about keeping the Americans in. Thank you for listening to me, and I stand by for any questions you may have.
Thank you, Sir Richard. We have about 30 minutes for questions, and I see quite a few already. We're going to start right here with Bill Obenstein, then we'll come to Adele next. There was a microphone coming. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir Richard. Your novel opens with the Russian establishment of the land bridge to Crimea, and of course NATO can't do anything about that because it's not a NATO member. Do you expect that is actually, would you call that a highly likely event? That is one of the next things that Putin would do, or what would it depend on, and what would the reaction be? What would the fallout from that be?
If I look at it from a strategic perspective, I would think it would be an entirely logical thing to do. Crimea is now de facto part of Russia, although it has not been recognized. And it's very difficult and expensive for Russia to, of course it's an island, and to reach it. You either have to build a bridge across the Sea of Azov, which I think they're doing, or you've got to find other ways in by air, and there's no way in by land. So it would be entirely logical for Russia to try and establish a land bridge to Ukraine. What do we do about it if and when it happens? This raises the question of support to Ukraine, more broadly. Clearly, Ukraine, as you say, does not come under the guarantee of Article 5, and so NATO's hands are limited. And it's absolutely right, I think, that NATO, in order to be effective, it has got to protect its source of strength, center of gravity, which is alliance cohesion, and there would be real reluctance for NATO. And of course, it is a defensive alliance, and to step out of that is risking the strength, the founding strength of NATO. So I would go down the line of bilateral support to Ukraine. I think Ukraine, and I know the issue of the nature of that support, lethal, non-lethal support to Ukraine is a live issue. I have to say I'm increasingly of the view that providing the legal aspects are properly looked after, in other words, that we're not handing lethal weapons to paramilitaries who might just come under that heading of what Putin described, the tendency to describe them as neo-Nazis and nationalists. Providing the legal, we are absolutely certain that we're providing assistance, lethal or otherwise, to properly constituted armed forces that come under a proper legal heading. Then I think that may well be the way to go in order to deter and avoid precisely that eventuality. But if Russia did establish a land corridor to Ukraine, there's frankly not a lot we could do about it.
All right, we'll come right here to Adele.
Thank you very much.
Microphone's coming.
I'm wondering if you could expand a little bit on what you mean by effective deterrence. What are some of the specifics, particularly for the U.S.?
Okay. What I mean by that is, number one, I would like to see, what we should be seeing is a really credible, effective military presence in the Baltic states. The NATO summit in Warsaw announced the establishment of 4 battalions in the 3 Baltic states and eastern Poland. Now, a battalion is around about 500 to 800 personnel. That is not 4 battalions is not a credible military force. For my money, it needs the minimum requirement, needs to be a properly joined up combined arms brigade, around about 5,000 personnel with combat, with attack helicopters, with artillery, with engineers, with logistics, with tanks, with infantry. And then more important than that almost as well is an overarching concept for battle, rather as we saw with the Cold War, particularly in the Central Front in the late 80s, when actually NATO had put together a very coherent joint air-land concept, army group and otherwise, which was demonstrably capable of soaking up a potential Soviet attack and then delivering a counterattack. And I think and then practiced it, hence the reforgers, hence third US Corps coming across regularly for NATO exercises. And that needs to be carefully integrated in with the 3 Baltic states. And at the moment, you don't have that. You've got the 3 Baltic states all thinking in their own little tram lines. You then superimpose a battalion on them. Okay, what about the command and control? What about the logistics? What about the integration? All these issues need to be thought through. And that needs to be done in a joint setting with air, able to move very quickly, because it's going to be fundamentally, it's going to be an air battle, initially, certainly, and a credible maritime presence as well. Part of that is effective NATO reserves. We've seen the establishment of the so-called Very High Readiness Joint Task Force at the NATO summit in 2014 in Wales. Okay, good start. 5,000, 14 different nations, haven't trained together, haven't worked together. You're going to require an Albanian company to drive from Albania, a Croatian company to drive from Croatia, a Portuguese battalion to drive from Western Portugal. How are you going to do that? What about your convoy? All these issues of military readiness need to be really thought through, and we could, again, take a leaf out of the Cold War. Those of you who might remember, there was something called the Ace Mobile Force, which was NATO's fire brigade, multinational, trained with a permanent command structure, regular training in northern Norway, southern Turkey, and that's the sort of mindset we need to get into, and we're a long way short of that. And then the third and fourth aspects is agility of decision-making, and there's lots of issues there, the North Atlantic Council, shape, and if Ivo was here, we'd be having a good old ding-dong debate about that, I dare say. But also money. money where your mouth is. And this is where the European members of NATO have got to step up to the mark. Now, I'm not optimistic about this at all. This 2% of GDP, and actually 2% of GDP recommended or by the NATO members themselves is probably not enough to rebuild lost capabilities. And this absolute and increasing dependence on the United States to underpin European defense has got to be stopped. How will we stop it? I think I despair, really, because it's only going to be done when people are really frightened. And my concern is that that's going to be too late.
So some hands over here. Let's go to John de Blasio and then Mark Whitehead next.
Thanks, General. You describe an enemy that has increasing intent and increasing capability at the same time. That's a double whammy on a threat. And it appears the calculus in the White House is that if we engage by lethally arming the Ukrainians or engaging more directly against Russia and Syria, that we will not be willing to escalate as much as they will, because we can't diagnose what they will do. As you said, with Putin, that process is not there, the diffusion of power. So what do you do? I mean, if you are not willing to escalate to the next level and your enemy is, then we're sort of checkmated. On the deterrence side, part of the quid pro quo of the post-Cold War agreement was that we wouldn't base troops in Eastern Europe. Is it time to permanently base troops in Poland and Romania and elsewhere? And lastly, the economic element of this is the Achilles heel for the Russians, the gas, the oil, and cutting them out of the Western European market for that. There seems to be a reticence on the part of the Western European nations to undercut that. And I guess at the end, if we do all those things, what does Russia do? And is that what we're afraid of? Is because they have this semi-uncertain power with very little diffusion and very high capabilities? Is that why we don't act? And what if we do all of those things? What will they do?
It was Frederick the Great who said music or diplomacy without arms is like music without instruments. And I think we are trying to escalate from a position of weakness is the wrong way of doing it. I think you have to escalate or you have to negotiate. And part of this is negotiation. But above all, front and center, it's got to be backed up by strength, which is why I think, and that's where the gap is, that actually we aren't strong as an alliance. Although with 3.5 million men and women under arms, the might of American power, you'd think we'd have it. But actually, the perception is one of weakness because locally, say the spotlight may be on the Baltic region, and I would not exclude here Finland and Sweden in this equation. We're talking NATO, but that's important to remember them. Where it matters, where the spotlight is, we are weak. So I think, and that affects, and the Russians will take that and look at that. So that affects the calculus in Syria. It affects the calculus elsewhere, because the Russians will not be looking at these in stovepipes. They will be thinking strategically in a way which perhaps the West does not. We tend to think in stovepipes, certainly in Western Europe. So my first thing is the importance of strength. And that goes, again, the leaf out of the Cold War. Why was the West, why was Reagan able to call the shots? Because of NATO's strength. Yes, of course, it was principally American strength, but the other NATO allies, in a way, did their bit much, much more than they're doing now. Moving on to your second point on the economics, the what can be done. Well, arguably, this is one area where the pressure continues, of course, with sanctions. And sanctions I know sanctions are a double-edged sword and all that, and but they have had an impact, and they will be certainly having an impact on the thinking in the Kremlin. Hence the push to divide and rule in Europe as much as possible with nuclear deals with Hungary, you could argue that the funding of organizations like the Front National in France, Marine Le Pen's party, support for UKIP in UK. This is all the establishment of a Sputnik TV and RT office in Edinburgh. This is all part of divide and rule to undermine the cohesion of Europe, particularly to look for and argue the initial deployment to Syria, I would argue, was all part of this, to undermine the will to maintain sanctions. But the economic piece, I think, it's critical. And I would also add the financial piece, because, I mean, this is the one thing that they will be really concerned is the strangling of the supply of money. And I am certain that the Treasury in the US and UK and other close allies will be looking at this bilaterally outside NATO on how to put a stranglehold on Russian money, because that'll send a real signal of fear, tremor of fear through the Russian system. And forgive me, your last point was?
On the deterrence factor of stationing.
Yeah. Well, and hence my first point on deterrence, about the importance of forward presence. Now, the NATO-Russia Founding Act precluded if we wanted to stick by that deal, and let's not forget, I mean, there are a number of deals that the Russians have signed up to which they've ripped up and thrown out of the window, not least the Budapest Memorandum of '94, which guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty. But if you were to stick by the NATO-Russia Founding Act, it precludes the maintenance of significant forces in the Baltic states in Eastern Europe. I would argue, firstly, that a combined arms brigade doesn't warrant the heading of significant forces. But I think the calculus has changed completely as well, because of the nature of the threat, because of the presence of 3 motor rifle divisions on the borders of the Baltic states, the level of military activity, the practicing of snap exercises, all highlight the importance of deterrence. And I think there will be many who say this is provocative, and there will be howls of outrage from Russia. But that, I think, rather in the lines of, it was Mandy Rice Davis of the Profumo who said, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Of course. But nevertheless, it sort of underestimates the Russian mentality here. My sense, and certainly talking to my friends in the Baltic states, many of whom have served as Soviet conscripts and know Russia very well from their upbringing, that Russia respects strength. And despises weakness. And where they see weakness, they'll continue to probe and push and find ways to get around it. Where they see strength, they respect strength. And that goes back to the first point about negotiating from a position of strength.
Okay, we'll come right here. If you saw the question mark, microphone's coming. Then we'll go to the next table back there.
I'm kind of following up with both of these questions about deterrence. And the aspect of deterrence that I'd like you to address, I understand the military thing. I understand the economic sanctions. But let's say I could wave a magic wand, and assuming we have Hillary as president and a Democratic Senate, which appears to be likely, and a hawkish kind of president, you could wave a wand. What would be your overall strategy and attitude toward Russia as a deterrent factor? And in answering that question, is it just Putin? Or where is his support? Does he have any government to dialogue with, to talk with, to have these backdoor conversations with? And oh, by the way, while we're doing this, what's China doing? And how are they going to take advantage of this instability?
Deterrence and dialogue and lines of communication to manage the relationship would be on my wish list. I've talked about the need for effective deterrence, and that I won't say any more about that, and being able to negotiate and operate from a position of strength. I touched on dialogue. The need perhaps to, the need to recognize, the need to open up lines of communication. Russia is a great nation. We need to live with Russia. We want to live with Russia. Arguably, we face, we need a strategic partnership with Russia to face many of the great challenges, security challenges of the age, not least the chaos in the Middle East and the spread of jihadist terrorism, and the instability of fragile states and the migrant crisis and those sort of major security challenges. But this is going to need careful management and the building up of a relationship, and that has got to be done with confidence-building measures from the start. But it's got to be done from a position where both sides are prepared to talk. And perhaps we should be talking from a position where, yes, we establish there are certain things which are non-negotiable, But maybe some things do need to be negotiable. Maybe we do need to take account, for example, of the fact that de facto Russia is in the Crimea. Nothing's going to change that. If anybody who's been to Sevastopol, it's as far as anything is a Russian city. Maybe we should recognize that and find some, and it will require some very clever diplomatic and legal footwork to meet that requirement. But all these things, I think, need to be put into the mix. China, well, my sense is that Russia needs China more than China needs Russia. Putin has established, he was very quick to sign a deal on an energy deal with China back in 2014. And actually, just picking up on the earlier point about, I think Russia, increasingly, those Western European nations that have been dependent on Russian energy are looking for diversification elsewhere, and they recognize the danger of being held hostage over energy. But is China going to take advantage in the short term? Quite possibly. In the longer term, I sense that China and the flexing of the muscles in the East and South China Sea is going to become increasingly a challenge for the United States as China's presence becomes an increasingly a major Pacific power. In the short term, there will continue to be issues that need to be managed. But my also sense is that China is another empire. Traditionally, historically, it's a mercantilist empire. And very much into mercantile expansion, as we see in Africa and elsewhere. But it's not been it hasn't traditionally been an empire that's grabbed land in its immediate vicinity. Largely because I think it's been so focused on trying to keep this extraordinarily diverse, almost ramshackle empire together, whether it's Tibet or the Western provinces, that it has to focus on protecting itself.
Right, we've just under 10 minutes. We'll go right here, and then we'll go back to the next table. Oh, yeah, you can go to Rick first, and then we'll come up next to Gary.
Thank you. It's interesting that in the debate last night, Secretary Clinton made a strong point about 17 counterintelligence agencies and defense intelligence agencies pinning the blame on Russia for all the hacking and cyber that's going on. Vice President Biden has said there's a response coming, just wait and see. You'll see what it is. You're here today to warn us of the threat of inaction with respect to the Russians. Mike Morrell, the former deputy director of the CIA, was in town this week, and on Monday gave a talk where he also emphasized the Russian threat, although he said sanctions are the answer, because the thing that Putin and the Kremlin most are afraid of is a Russian April spring, similar to what happened in the Arab countries. So it's beginning to sound like there's a drumbeat going on here. North Korea seems to be fading in the background. Iran is fading in the background. And the boogeyman now is Russia. To what do you attribute that? Is that serious a threat that all these diverse elements are coming together to point in that one direction?
Well, I think you only have to look at what's been happening. I think it's the reality that 2014 changed the nature of the relationship with Russia fundamentally. And what we've seen since then is this, and actually arguably goes back further than that, of course. 2014 was the immediate, and we should have been watching the signs for this. But as Putin has become more in control of the levers of power, you might go back to the final paying off of Russia's foreign debt as the moment that Putin was able to step forward and actually begin to flex his muscles more. Go back even further to the years of the 1990s when Russia and NATO were working remarkably closely together, as indeed were a number of Western and American organizations working in Moscow as well. So I think the reason there is this recognized drumbeat is fact. It's the fact that we look at what's going on and we recognize that this is close to home, and it's really important because it's potentially existential. Because if it got to the stage where we sleepwalk into the ultimate train crash with Russia, that's going to change all our lives in a very fundamental way.
All right, right here.
Excluding the Baltic states, the general impression is that how do you defend someone that has no interest in being defended? it doesn't appear that the major European powers have any interest in being participatory in any area opposing Russia. So what things do you think have to happen, and this is especially true of Germany? You mentioned the pacifist democracies, but I mean their level of support, I think, is abysmal. So what would you see as actions that have to take place in Europe in order for Europe to defend Europe?
Well, I wish I could give you an easy checklist of things to be done which we could achieve, but this is about changing the minds of European electorates, and I fear by design or default we have now got ourselves into a position where most European electorates are not prepared to see higher defense spending at the expense of social welfare spending and the like. How do you change that? The only way you change it is through fear and the recognition that actually that comfortable life is on a very fine knife edge, and that in order to maintain that sort of comfortable way of life, we need to be prepared to pay the price of maintaining peace. It's about a recognition or a persuasion that peace is not necessarily the default setting. We've enjoyed 70 years, a long peace in Europe, Western Europe, since the end of the Second World War, and only through being prepared to arm ourselves, go back to the old Roman adage, if you want peace, prepare for war. Getting that message across is very difficult. But now I've painted a pretty gloomy picture. Let's look at the positives for a start, for a moment. Germany has been prepared to offer up a battalion to be forward based in the Baltic states. Now that's quite a significant change. It doesn't take away the fact that, and I know and respect and I love my time in Germany, and I think it's a great nation, but there's no question that the history and the legacy of the 20th century hangs around the German neck a little bit like an albatross, that the use of legal, lethal state power is still pretty much off limits. How do you change all that? I just don't know, except by constantly the drumbeat. But then, of course, you get accused of being inflammatory and crying wolf. But I think we need to get the message across that, yes, we are crying wolf, but actually the wolf is arguably pretty close to the chicken coop, if not in the chicken coop already.
We have time for one more quick question. I want to make sure we get we'll go to here, Lisa, right here. There's a microphone coming.
I listened to your recommendations for what we needed to do on the military side to move from 4 battalions to a combined arms brigade, an overarching concept for battle and exercising that concept. And I wonder if that approach doesn't play exactly into Putin's hands and demonstrate that NATO is indeed not just encircling Russia, but threatening it in a very direct way. And so I wonder if you're placing too much emphasis on the military aspects of our or the military sort of tools we have, and not looking enough at other tools like what Mike Morrell suggested, focusing on economic pressure on Russia, which could have a very severe impact, and we've seen that the sanctions are having a real impact in Russia, without creating this perception in Russia that NATO and the West are posing a direct threat.
I think I plead guilty in that answer to perhaps focusing rather more on the military than the other levers of power. Just on the military, I think to be effective military deterrence has got to be capable and credible. So I think that's the key point there. But it's got to be accompanied, and I think you're absolutely right, it's got to be accompanied by a comprehensive approach that takes into account other levers of power, economic, financial, the building up of civic society, a very strong information operations, strategic communication piece that tries to get a message, through to people in Russia as much as anything of the path down which the danger of the path down which they're potentially being led by their leadership. I would also say that certainly for the three Baltic states, there's more that could be done, perhaps. Actually, NATO working in concert, for example, with the European Union. And the European Union is very capable of deploying a degree of soft power, and indeed does at the moment, spending significant amounts of money on social development programs in cities like Narva, a Russian-speaking city right on the Estonian-Russian border, with real social development problems and a deprived region, to send the message that actually of the benefits of being, so to offset the danger of being persuaded and that it's a better deal to go to Russia. Now, actually, the reality is that I think 99% of Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian Russian speakers are much happier to be citizens of Latvia, Lithuania, and Russia. But there are the issues of the non-citizens, for example, those who have no passport as a result of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and all those potentially can be manipulated. So, and the European Union, I think, can offer support in building civic society, communications, countering the propaganda effort. So I think it is absolutely that wide suite of activity, accompanied by really strong strategic communications that says NATO is a defensive alliance, that we are in the business of protecting ourselves, and meanwhile it goes back to the dialogue as well and building a relationship with Russia too. But thank you.
That is all the time we have. The book War with Russia is for sale by our friends at the bookseller right over here, and I believe Sir Richard will sign it. For now, please join me in thanking him for his comments.
Thank you.